3 men vanished from America's most secure prison in June of 1962. 50-year. Old photograph forced investigators to reconsider everything. For nearly 6 decades, the world believed this case was already closed. The official conclusion arrived quickly. They drowned. The bay took them. The FBI declared them presumed dead in 1979 and shut the file. But in 2020, an artificial intelligence system examined a photograph taken in Brazil in 1975. 2 men. A farm, 13 years after the escape. The AI returned a match probability of 85 to 90%. That number did not solve the Alcatraz mystery. It simply made the official explanation harder to accept. This is not a story about certainty. After 6 decades of evidence, letters, photographs, and now artificial intelligence, the honest answer is still that no one knows what happened to Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers in the dark water of San Francisco Bay. But the question itself has never been more serious. The prison. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary opened in 1934 on a 2.2-acre rock in the middle of San Francisco Bay. 1.25 miles from shore, close enough to see the city lights from your cell at night. Far enough that reaching those lights was considered, by every expert who examined the geography, essentially impossible. The prison held the men other facilities could not contain. Al Capone served time there. George Machine Gun Kelly, Robert Stroud, the Birdman of Alcatraz. These were inmates who had broken rules, broken out of lesser facilities, and exhausted the patience of the federal system. Alcatraz was where they sent you when everywhere else had failed. But the walls and guard towers were never the real security. The water was. The bay runs at 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, cold enough to cause hypothermia within 20 minutes. The tidal currents peak at 6 to 8 miles per hour, strong enough to pull an experienced swimmer well off course without warning. The distance itself, over a mile of open water in total darkness, would challenge a trained athlete under controlled conditions. Prison administrators promoted this geography deliberately. They declared, publicly and repeatedly, that escape was impossible. Over 29 years, 36 men attempted it in 14 separate incidents. Most were caught immediately, some were shot, 2 drowned, and their bodies washed ashore. Not once had anyone definitively proven you could leave Alcatraz and survive. Frank Morris intended to be the first. The man and the plan. Frank Lee Morris arrived at Alcatraz in January 1960. Prisoner A-1441, cell 138, Buck Block. He was serving time for bank robbery, but Morris was not a typical prisoner. His IQ tested at 133. He had escaped from other federal facilities before, not through force, but through the kind of sustained, obsessive observation that most people simply cannot maintain. He studied systems the way other men studied nothing, looking for the single point where something designed to be impenetrable was actually just unexamined. He arrived at Alcatraz and began watching. For months, he tracked guard rotation patterns. He memorized the rhythms of the cell block. He was the kind of man who found confinement not just uncomfortable but personally intolerable, as if the walls were a problem that demanded a solution, and the solution was only a matter of time. In late 1961, sitting alone in cell 138, he found what he had been looking for. The concrete around the ventilation grill at the back of his cell felt different. Decades of salt air had been working on the structure silently. When Morris pressed his fingernail against it, pieces broke away without effort. The wall was rotting from inside, and no one had noticed. He recruited carefully. John Anglin, cell 150, and his brother Clarence, cell 152, had grown up in a large Georgian farming family, swimming in cold water from childhood, physically comfortable in conditions that would stop most people. Alan West, cell 140, worked maintenance and had access to tools the others could not reach. What followed was 6 months of preparation that bordered on the extraordinary. Spoons stolen from the cafeteria were sharpened into chisels. A vacuum motor was modified into a drill. Each night after lights out, working in shifts behind cardboard grill replicas painted to match the original metal, they chipped away at the rotting concrete. To mask the sound, Morris played his concertina loudly during music hour, while the others worked behind the noise. Dummy heads were molded from dissolved soap and toilet paper, finished with real human hair Clarence collected from the barbershop floor over months. More than 50 raincoats, stolen one at a time, were hand-stitched into a raft and life vests, seams, pressed against steam pipes to bond the rubber more permanently. 6 months. Stolen spoons, borrowed hair, a plan that should not have worked. The night. The 11th of June, 1962. Lights out. 9:30 p.m. Guards moved through B block. They passed cell 138, cells 150 and 152. Dummy heads on pillows, blankets pulled up. The guards moved on. Morris removed the false vent cover and entered the utility corridor. The Anglin brothers followed. Alan West, at his own wall, found that the concrete he had resealed weeks earlier had set completely solid. He could not get through. Morris returned to West's wall and pulled from the corridor side, while West pushed from inside. Every second they remained increased the chance that a flashlight would sweep the passage and end 6 months of work in an instant. The patrol rotation was moving. There were no good moments left, only worsening ones. After 15 minutes, Morris told West they were out of time. They left him. West later told investigators he could hear them moving further through the corridor. The sounds of climbing, of equipment shifting, growing quieter, and then nothing. Just the hum of the prison settling around him and the knowledge that the escape he had spent 6 months building was happening without him, somewhere above his head, in the dark. He eventually broke through his own wall. He reached the roof. He looked out at the bay. They were already gone. The 3 men had climbed the plumbing pipes inside the utility corridor. 30 feet of vertical ascent in darkness, reached the ventilation shaft, lifted the loosened cover, and crawled across the rooftop while searchlights swept the compound below. They descended the exterior drain pipe. John moved too fast. His landing produced a loud impact at 10:45 p.m. A guard reported it. The lieutenant investigated and found nothing. By 11 p.m., the 3 men were at the water's edge on the island's north shore. Think about what that moment was. Standing at the edge of San Francisco Bay in the dark, holding a raft made from raincoats. The water at 50 degrees, the current invisible but present. 1¼ miles of open bay between them and the mainland, with no way to know, until they were already committed to it, whether the raft would hold. They pushed off into the black water, and the darkness closed around them. The case for drowning. At the 7 a.m. count on June 12th, a guard struck the pillow in cell 138. The dummy head rolled to the floor, and its nose snapped off on impact. The alarm sounded within minutes. What investigators found over the following days was, honestly, more consistent with disaster than survival. On Angel Island, 2 miles north of Alcatraz, searchers found raft fragments, rubberized material, wood consistent with the paddles. A torn life vest appeared floating in the bay days later. A waterproof package surfaced near the Golden Gate Bridge, containing Anglin family photographs. The FBI's position was straightforward. The raft debris suggested structural failure. The torn life vest suggested someone had gone into the water. 50-degree temperature would have caused incapacitation within minutes. The currents were strong enough that night to carry bodies away from shore, and not every drowning victim surfaces. They drowned. The bay won. That was the official conclusion, and for decades, it was not an unreasonable one. But every decade that passed was supposed to bury the escape deeper. Instead, the evidence kept resurfacing. What kept surfacing? The FBI closed its file in 1979. The U.S. Marshals Service never did. In the years that followed, the Anglin family received unsigned Christmas cards handwriting relatives believed they recognized, postmarks that traced nowhere. In 1973, when the brothers' mother died, 2 unusually tall women appeared at the funeral in heavy makeup. They spoke to no one and left before the service ended. The family believed they knew who those women were. Frank Morris left none of these traces. No unsigned cards, no mysterious appearances. After the night he entered the bay, Morris became almost ghost-like present in the escape story, absent from everything that followed. The Anglin brothers left breadcrumbs, intentional or not. Morris left only silence. Whether that silence means he died in the water or simply disappeared more completely than anyone else managed is a question no one has answered. In 1993, a former associate stated in an interview that the men had arranged for someone to meet them on the Tiburon shoreline after the escape and drive them south. FBI records independently showed that Morris had purchased a Berlitz self-teaching Spanish workbook while in prison months before the escape date. Then, in January 2013, the impossible happened. A handwritten letter arrived at the San Francisco Police Department, postmarked inside the United States. The writer claimed to be John Anglin, 83 years old, dying of cancer. Yes, we all made it that night, but barely. Frank passed away in October 2008. His grave is in Argentina under another name. My brother died in 2011. FBI analysts examined it. Handwriting was compared to pre-incarceration samples. Paper and ink were chemically tested. The results came back inconclusive, not confirmed authentic, not confirmed fabricated. Measurable similarities to Anglin's known handwriting, nothing definitive either way. The department never responded. If it was John Anglin, he waited his entire life for an answer that never came. The photograph. For decades, it had been sitting in evidence files like a ghost no one could identify. A photograph allegedly taken in Brazil in 1975 sent anonymously to a friend of the Anglin family with no note and no return address. Two men in their late 40s on what appeared to be a farm. Weathered, sun-darkened skin. The quiet look of men who had been living outdoors and anonymously for a long time. They looked like the Anglin brothers aged 13 years forward. In 2015, forensic analysts obtained high-resolution scans and applied the best facial comparison technology then available, examining bone geometry, eye spacing, nose structure, jawline. The analysis found significant similarities, but could not produce the certainty required for identification. The photograph remained unresolved. In 2020, the Irish forensic agency IdentV applied modern AI facial recognition to the same image. These systems ignored the hair, the wrinkles, even the lighting. They measured the parts of the face that time struggles to erase the geometry of the bone structure beneath the surface, the precise ratios between features, the subtle asymmetries unique to each individual that remain constant across decades, regardless of how someone has aged or where they have lived. It is worth being honest about the limitations. The Brazil photograph is an outdoor snapshot decades old, not a professional portrait. Aging estimation carries uncertainty. The 85 to 90% figure is a statistical probability, not a fingerprint match, not a DNA confirmation. But what IdentV returned was this. For the man on the left, compared to John Anglin, 85 to 90% probability of a positive match. For the man on the right, compared to Clarence Anglin, 80 to 85%. In forensic practice, those numbers reopen files. They do not close them. AI did not solve the Alcatraz mystery. It introduced a measurable, statistically grounded challenge to an official position that had been treated as settled for 40 years. Separately, in 2014, researchers at Delft University modeled the tidal conditions of the 11th of June 1962. Their finding, if the men launched at approximately 11:30 p.m., consistent with the timeline, the currents that night would likely have carried them toward the Marin County shore rather than out to the Pacific. The modeling suggested the crossing was more survivable than anyone had officially acknowledged. Suggested, not confirmed. Where it stands. Place everything side by side. The case for drowning remains coherent. Freezing water, strong currents, raft debris suggesting structural failure, a torn life vest. No confirmed sightings in the months immediately after. The simplest explanation that three men on a makeshift raft in 50-degree water in complete darkness did not survive is not unreasonable. The deeper investigators looked, the less the official story behaved like a closed case. No bodies recovered from a bay that reliably returns its dead. Footprints on Angel Island leading away from raft fragments. A waterproof package of family photographs, the kind you protect when you expect to arrive somewhere. unsigned Christmas cards across decades. A letter in 2013 with unresolved handwriting similarities, offering specific details only the escapees would know. Tidal modeling suggesting the departure window was survivable. And a photograph from Brazil returning an 80 to 90% facial match to the Anglin brothers. The U.S. Marshals Service confirms the status literally. Their warrant for Frank Morris and John and Clarence Anglin remains active today, in 2026. Officially, they are still fugitives. What AI contributed to this case was not a verdict. It contributed a number, a measurable challenge, to a conclusion that had been treated as inevitable for 4 decades. And it forced the question the official record has never cleanly answered. If 3 men drowned in San Francisco Bay on the 12th of June 1962, then who is in that photograph? The dummy heads are on display at Alcatraz today. Tourists walk past cell 138 and look at the ventilation hole Morris spent months creating with a sharpened spoon. What was once an institutional embarrassment has become a legend, and the legend has grown larger every year for 6 decades. Here is the detail that stays with me. If Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers survived that crossing, if they built new lives somewhere, under new names, in another country, then for the rest of their lives they would have watched that legend grow around them. Documentaries, books, films, museum exhibits with their own faces on display. Somewhere in a museum gift shop, tourists buy postcards of 3 men who may have spent decades alive, anonymous, and watching. They would have read the FBI's conclusion that they drowned. They would have seen their own wanted posters age into historical curiosities. They would have watched true crime communities debate whether they lived or died, and they could never say a word. Not once, not to anyone, not even at the end. Maybe they drowned that night. Maybe they didn't. But after 60 years, the evidence no longer supports certainty in either direction. And if Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers truly crossed that water, if they reached the shore, disappeared into the world, and spent the rest of their lives watching the story of their own escape become history, then 3 men with stolen spoons and homemade raincoats did not just escape from Alcatraz. They escaped from history itself.